Have you ever bought an expensive, incredibly beautiful plant, only to be told you have to wait 3 to 5 years just to see a single flower? That is exactly what happens to most gardeners when they bring home a young Bartzella Peony. The golden rule of the gardening world is that you should never, ever fertilize a first-year peony, because you might burn the roots or encourage weak growth. But what if I told you that this widely accepted advice is actually holding your garden back? Today, we are going to look at exactly what happened when I completely ignored the experts, broke the rules, and gave my young Bartzella Peony a very specific, highly targeted feeding. I promise you, the results you are about to hear about are going to completely change the way you look at plant nutrition. I always love a good gardening debate. So tell me in the comments right now, do you strictly follow the rules with your new plants? Or do you like to experiment and push the boundaries? Before we get into the secret feeding routine, we need to understand exactly what we are dealing with. The Bartzella is not just any ordinary flower. It is an Itoh hybrid, which is a magical cross between a traditional herbaceous garden peony and a woody tree peony. This incredible breeding breakthrough gave us massive, fluffy, bright yellow flowers on strong stems that do not flop over in the rain. But because they are hybrids, they are usually quite expensive, and they start their lives as very vulnerable, somewhat slow-growing young plants. When you plant a new Bartzella, it is spending all of its energy trying to establish a massive, deep root system underground. The common fear is that if you add fertilizer, the plant will panic, push out a bunch of green leaves, and completely forget about building those essential roots. That is the historical context of why everyone is so terrified to feed them. But I knew there had to be a way to support both root development and early blooming without destroying this beautiful investment. So let us start by breaking down the biggest myth in peony care, which is the idea of the starving young plant. People think that by withholding food, they are forcing the roots to dig deeper into the native soil to search for nutrients. Picture a sad, starving plant, desperately clawing through hard clay just to survive. That sounds terrible, right? While it is true that we want deep roots, starving a hybrid plant that was bred for massive energy output makes absolutely no sense. The Bartzella has huge, thick, fleshy roots that act like giant storage batteries. If those batteries are empty in the first year, the plant simply cannot store enough energy to survive a harsh winter and produce blooms the following spring. By providing a gentle, specific type of food right away, we are basically hooking those roots up to a fast charger. I realized that the goal was not to starve the plant into submission, but to give it the exact building blocks it needed to create a massive underground fortress. This realization completely changed my approach to young peony care. The first major mistake people make when they finally decide to fertilize is reaching for the standard, all-purpose blue powder that is loaded with nitrogen. Nitrogen is fantastic for growing big, green, leafy vegetables, but it is the absolute enemy of a young peony that you want to eventually bloom. If you pump a Bartzella full of nitrogen, it will act like a teenager on a sugar rush. It will shoot up a ton of tall, weak, floppy stems and huge leaves. Picture a plant that is all foliage and no substance. Those soft stems will snap in the first heavy wind, and worse, the plant will completely ignore bud production. It will focus entirely on the green growth. My secret formula specifically avoided high nitrogen. I needed the plant to stay compact, strong, and focused on the underground structure. I learned very quickly that when you are dealing with flowering perennials, reading the nutrient numbers on the back of the bag is the difference between a garden full of leaves and a garden full of spectacular, show-stopping flowers. Instead of nitrogen, the true foundation of my young plant feeding experiment was an overwhelming focus on phosphorus. Phosphorus is the key that unlocks aggressive, healthy root expansion. Think of it as pouring a solid concrete foundation for a massive skyscraper. Without it, the whole structure eventually collapses. I specifically sought out a natural, slow-release form of phosphorus. I wanted something that would sit in the soil and slowly dissolve every time it rained, providing a steady, gentle drip of root-building power. When you apply phosphorus correctly, the thick, tuberous roots of the Itoh peony start to branch out, creating a dense, fibrous network that anchors the plant deeply into the earth. This incredible underground expansion is what guarantees the plant will be able to drink up enough water during the scorching hot days of midsummer. By focusing almost entirely on phosphorus in that crucial first stage, I was setting the stage for everything miraculous that happened later in the season. Now, let me tell you about the secret weapon I used, which is something a lot of modern gardeners overlook: organic bone meal. Bone meal is essentially an ancient gardening secret that has been used for generations, but it works absolute wonders on Itoh peonies. It is packed with calcium and slow-release phosphorus. Imagine you are giving your plant a slow-cooked, highly nutritious meal instead of a fast-food energy spike. When I sprinkled the bone meal around the base of the Bartzella, I knew I was doing something special. But here is the trick. You cannot just throw it on top of the mulch. I carefully scratched it into the top 2 inches of the soil, making sure it made direct contact with the earth where the soil microbes could start breaking it down. This process creates a symbiotic relationship beneath the surface. The microbes eat the bone meal, and in return, they release the nutrients in a format that the young peony roots can easily absorb. It is a beautiful, natural cycle that completely bypasses the harsh chemicals. The actual physical technique of applying the fertilizer is just as important as what you are using. This brings us to a concept I like to call the ring of power. A huge mistake beginners make is dumping fertilizer right on top of the center of the plant, directly onto the crown where the stems meet the roots. This is a guaranteed way to cause chemical burns and encourage fungal diseases, which will kill a young peony in a matter of weeks. Instead, I imagined a circle drawn around the plant, right beneath the outermost tips of the leaves. This is where the feeder roots live. I applied my bone meal and nutrient mix in this outer ring, completely avoiding the center of the plant. Think of it like serving food on a plate that surrounds the plant, forcing the roots to stretch outward to reach the meal. This ring of power technique not only protects the delicate crown of the Bartzella from rot, but it actively encourages the root system to grow wider and stronger, making the plant significantly more drought tolerant. After establishing the root base with phosphorus, I introduced the third critical element to my feeding routine: potassium. Potassium is the armor of the plant world. It is the nutrient that regulates water pressure inside the plant cells and thickens the cell walls. Picture a medieval knight putting on a heavy suit of armor before going into battle. That is what potassium does for a young peony. By giving the Bartzella a healthy dose of potassium, I was preparing it to fight off summer heat waves, unexpected cold snaps, and common fungal diseases like botrytis, which love to attack weak peonies. I noticed that as soon as the potassium became available in the soil, the stems of my young plant felt completely different to the touch. They were no longer soft and easily bendable. They felt rigid, woody, and incredibly strong. This was the moment I realized that my unconventional feeding plan was actually working. I was building a structurally sound plant that could handle the weight of its future gigantic flowers. To make sure all of these nutrients were actually being absorbed, I utilized a fascinating organic additive: liquid humic acid. Humic acid is not a fertilizer itself, but rather a nutrient unlocker. Over time, elements like phosphorus can become bound up in the soil, completely locked away where the plant cannot use them. It is like having $1 million locked in a safe, but you lost the combination. Humic acid acts as the master key. It breaks down the tight bonds in the soil, making the bone meal and potassium instantly available to the plant roots. I mixed a dark, rich solution of humic acid and watered it into my fertilizer ring. It looked like I was pouring strong black coffee onto the soil. The transformation in the soil structure was almost immediate. It became looser, darker, and held moisture much better. By using humic acid, I ensured that not a single ounce of my secret fertilizer was wasted, maximizing the potential of this young, eager Bartzella peony. Of course, no fertilizer works without the right watering technique. After applying my dry amendments and the humic acid, I had to execute a deep watering routine. You see, sprinkling the top of the soil for 5 minutes with a hose does absolutely nothing. The water just evaporates. I needed to create a gentle, slow soaking process that would pull the nutrients down deep into the root zone. I set a hose on a slow trickle right over the fertilizer ring and let it run for an hour. Picture making a slow brewed tea, where the water is carefully extracting all the goodness and carrying it down into the earth. This deep watering encouraged those roots we talked about to dive even deeper, chasing the moisture and the food. I only did this once a week, allowing the topsoil to dry out between waterings to prevent root rot. This disciplined watering schedule, combined with the heavy nutrient load, created the perfect storm for explosive, healthy growth that simply blew me away. During the first 2 weeks after this intense feeding, the waiting game began. When you try a new plant care hack, there is always that terrifying period where you wonder if you just made a huge mistake. I checked the Bartzella every single day. At first, it was like watching paint dry. Nothing seemed to be happening above ground. But then, right around day 14, a massive shift occurred. The color of the foliage started to change. Normally, a first-year plant has somewhat pale, slightly yellowish-green leaves as it struggles to adapt to its new home. But my plant began to transform into a deep, rich, dark emerald green. It looked like someone had turned up the saturation on a photograph. The leaves looked thick, glossy, and incredibly vibrant. This deep green color was the visual proof that the roots had successfully absorbed the nutrients and were pumping massive amounts of energy up into the canopy. The plant was no longer merely surviving, it was actively thriving. As the 3rd week approached, the physical structure of the plant began to change in a way that is highly unusual for a first-year Itoh peony. The stems, which had started out roughly the thickness of a standard wooden pencil, began to swell. They grew visibly thicker, transitioning to the size of a large permanent marker. This was the potassium and the phosphorus working in perfect harmony. The plant was literally building the heavy-duty infrastructure required to support giant blooms. Most young peonies have thin, wispy stems that bend over and touch the dirt after a heavy rain. But my Bartzella was standing straight up, rigid and defiant. I could push on the stems with my hand and they would spring right back into place with incredible tension. It was at this moment that I knew the rule book was completely wrong. Starving this plant would have resulted in weak, flimsy growth. Feeding it correctly had turned it into an absolute powerhouse of a shrub. And then, the moment I thought was impossible finally happened. It was early May, and I was doing my morning walk around the garden. I knelt down to inspect the center of the Bartzella, parting the thick emerald leaves. Right there, at the tip of the strongest, thickest stem, was a tiny, perfectly round, green sphere. It was a flower bud, on a first-year plant. The gardening forums tell you this takes at least 3 years, but here it was, staring right back at me. Finding that hidden gem was one of the most exciting moments I have ever had in my garden. It proved that the heavy root development we encouraged with the bone meal had allowed the plant to store enough excess energy to actually attempt reproduction. The plant felt so secure, so well fed, and so anchored in the soil that it decided it was ready to show off. The secret fertilizer routine had dramatically accelerated the biological clock of the plant. Now, encountering a first-year bud brings us to another massive myth in the peony community: the rule that you must immediately pinch off the first flower bud. The old logic says that if you let a young plant bloom, it will exhaust itself and die the next winter. It sounds brutal, like cutting off your first paycheck just to prove a point. I completely rejected this idea. I looked at the incredible thickness of the stem, the dark green, disease-free foliage, and the obvious vigor of the plant. This was not a weak plant struggling to survive. This was a supercharged, highly fed Bartzella that was more than capable of supporting a single flower. I made the controversial decision to leave the bud entirely alone. I wanted to see exactly what this young plant could do with the nutrient profile I had given it. I firmly believe that if you feed a plant correctly from day one, you do not need to aggressively prune away its natural desire to create beauty. While the bud was slowly developing, I noticed that the micronutrients in my fertilizer mix were really starting to shine. Along with the major players like phosphorus, my organic mix contained traces of iron and magnesium. These are like daily vitamins for your plants. If a plant lacks iron, the new leaves will turn yellow, while the veins stay green, a condition called chlorosis. But my Bartzella showed absolutely zero signs of stress. The magnesium was helping the plant process sunlight more efficiently, creating massive amounts of natural sugars through photosynthesis. These sugars were being pumped directly into that single growing flower bud. The bud started out the size of a marble, then swelled to the size of a golf ball, and eventually became as large as a tennis ball before it even began to open. Watching the sheer volume of plant material being generated day by day was absolutely fascinating, and it was entirely fueled by that early spring feeding. During this critical bud swelling phase, we experienced a bizarre week of wild weather fluctuations. We had 2 days of intense 90-degree heat, followed immediately by 3 days of cold, heavy, pouring rain. Normally, this kind of stress will cause a young peony to abort its bud. The bud will simply turn brown, dry up, and fall off, leaving you heartbroken. Think of it like a roller coaster ride that makes the plant sick. However, because of the deep, expansive root system we built with the phosphorus and the thick, armored cell walls created by the potassium, my Bartzella did not even flinch. It weathered the heat wave by drawing water from deep underground, and it handled the freezing rain without a single spot of fungal rot. The fertilizer had not just made the plant grow fast, it had made the plant incredibly resilient to environmental chaos. It was bulletproof. Finally, the tension reached its absolute peak. The tennis ball-sized bud began to show the first cracks of color. Through the tight green sepals, I could see bright neon flashes of yellow pushing their way out. You could literally feel the pressure building inside the flower. It was like a balloon that had been pumped so full of air it was just seconds away from popping. The anticipation was overwhelming. Every morning I would run out with my coffee, expecting it to be fully open, and every morning it teased me just a little bit more. The sheer size of the unopened bud on such a young plant was a testament to the incredible energy reserves we had built up. It was drawing up all those stored sugars, all the water, and all the nutrients from our early spring feeding, preparing for a massive display of floral fireworks. On a sunny Tuesday morning, it happened. The bud exploded open, revealing a flower that defied all logical expectations. The bloom was absolutely gigantic, measuring a full 8 inches across. It was a massive, semi-double cup of the most brilliant, glowing lemon yellow you can possibly imagine, with distinct, vivid red flares hidden at the very center of the petals. It looked like a miniature sun had suddenly appeared in the middle of my garden bed. The petals were thick, almost feeling like fine leather, which is a direct result of the perfect mineral balance in the soil. The stem, which we had thickened up weeks ago, held this massive weight perfectly upright, never drooping even slightly. I just stood there in absolute awe. This was a plant that was supposed to do nothing but grow a few leaves this year, and instead, it had produced a flower worthy of a magazine cover. What surprised me just as much as the visual impact was the scent. Herbaceous peonies are known for their fragrance. But Itoh hybrids, like the Bartzella, have a very unique, slightly spicy, incredibly sweet lemon scent. Because the plant was so healthy and robust, the fragrance it produced was overwhelmingly powerful. Within hours of the flower opening, my garden turned into a busy airport for pollinators. Massive bumblebees were burying themselves completely inside the giant yellow petals, emerging completely covered in yellow pollen. The flower was so large and so well supported by the thick stem that 3 or 4 heavy bees could land on it at the same time without the flower bending at all. It was a perfect, thriving micro-ecosystem, all made possible by ignoring the standard advice and providing targeted, intelligent nutrition to a young plant. The bloom lasted for an incredible 12 days before the petals finally began to drop. That is an exceptionally long lifespan for a single peony flower, and again, I credit the heavy potassium feeding for giving the petals such incredible staying power. But the story does not end when the flower fades. A lot of gardeners make the mistake of ignoring their plants once the show is over. I knew that the post-bloom period was just as critical as the spring feeding. I carefully snipped off the spent flower head so the plant would not waste any energy trying to produce seeds. Now the Bartzella had the rest of the summer to use its massive dark green leaves to absorb sunlight and recharge those underground root batteries for the winter. The plant continued to look like a beautiful, lush green shrub all the way until the first hard frost of autumn. As autumn approached and the leaves finally began to naturally die back and turn brown, I did something crucial to ensure the success of the following year. I completely cut the stems down to the ground, just above the pink little eyes that were already forming for next spring. This is when I applied my final, gentle feeding of the year. I added a small handful of organic compost and just a light dusting of bone meal over the root zone. This late-season application is not for growing leaves. It is strictly for the roots to slowly digest over the long, cold winter months. It is like tucking the plant into bed with a warm cup of tea. I knew that beneath the frozen ground, the massive root system we had built was safely resting, fully charged and ready to explode with even more stems and multiple giant yellow flowers the following year. Reflecting on this entire experiment, the lesson is incredibly clear. Every garden is different, and while general rules are helpful, they are not absolute laws. The idea that a young Bartzella peony must be starved and left alone for years is simply a myth that prevents gardeners from experiencing the true potential of these magnificent plants. By understanding the science of root development, avoiding high nitrogen, and focusing on phosphorus, potassium, and soil health with humic acid, we completely bypassed the waiting period. We turned a fragile, expensive young plant into a strong, blooming powerhouse in a single season. It requires a little more thought and a specific application technique, but the reward of seeing that massive, glowing yellow flower in year 1 is absolutely worth every single second of effort. And there you have it, the complete, unexpected journey of my first year Bartzella Peony. The absolute turning point was realizing that starvation is not a strategy for success. By ignoring the old rules and carefully applying a nutrient profile focused strictly on root expansion and stem strength, we achieved the impossible: a massive 8-inch perfect yellow bloom on a baby plant. The significance here is huge for all of us. It means you do not have to wait half a decade to enjoy your expensive hybrid peonies. You just need to feed them smart, not hard. To summarize, keep the nitrogen low, load up on the bone meal for phosphorus, use humic acid to unlock the soil, and never pour fertilizer directly on the crown of the plant. Thank you so much for watching and going on this gardening adventure with me. If you want to see exactly how this plant performs next year, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Now, I want to hear from you. What is the most stubborn plant in your garden right now? And what crazy tricks have you tried to get it to bloom? Let us discuss it down in the comments.